everyone, welcome to Dover Paranormal's Paranormal Tech Talk. This is episode 4. Today's episode I'm going to be discussing something that most paranormal investigators use, but it's something that I don't think a whole lot of thought's given to. And that's on audio recordings. Now, the thing about audio recordings and EVP work specifically is it's a little more complex than what most people think. There's a lot more involved in what's going on. The first thing we have to understand about voice recordings and EVP work is that there is no way to capture actual audio. For instance, you can't take a mason jar and speak into it, put the lid on it, and 3 days later open it up and expect to hear sound. You can't capture actual audio. What you do have is you have representations of that audio, and they come in there are two main characteristics or ways that you can look at it. The first is an analog version, which is basically a like a tape recorder or a vinyl record. That would be considered analog, which is, at the end of the day, it's an electromagnetic type of representation. And then you have digital representation, which is voice recorders, microphones, and computers, and that's in a digital format, and that is the digital representation. So there is no real way to capture actual audio. It's just representations. And there are differences between those two, and I'll be discussing them. Now, let's go back to the beginning about voice recorders, and they're created for one reason. And that's to record sound and to record it as long as possible. They're great for interviews and keeping logs of investigations and all that. They're relatively cheap, and they're built in a way that cost is a primary concern. But there can be some pitfalls to that as well. To start with, digital recorders they're made for long record times, and some people see this as a huge advantage. But we're going to take a closer look and see how they pull this off, these longer recording times. Sometimes they can go as much as 100 hours, depending on how much memory is available for, that particular recorder. Now, digital recorders work by taking an analog signal, which is a sound wave, and sampling it, taking little samples of it thousands of times a second. And then what it does is it converts it to a digital equivalent in the form of ones and zeros to the same signal level at that specific time. Now, these digital samples or these digital values, they're stored one by one in memory, and then later the recording is played back. The digital value is converted back to an analog level by the codec, which is a compression-decompression algorithm in audio and video. It's then amplified, and then it's heard over a speaker. Many people want long recording times because, they don't want to run out of memory. So there's ways that they make these recording times longer. Now they can extend them, the recording times, in two different ways. First, they can lower the sample rate, and this takes fewer samples each second, which makes the available memory last longer before it fills up. And secondly, they can compress the audio files they make. Now, this is a process where parts of the recording file are deemed unnecessary and they're removed. These are typically responses from the microphone that are above and below what the human ear can hear. So there's no need to keep that if you can't hear it anyway, because remember, this was designed to, for dictation, for human speech. Now, making these smallers, in my opinion, doesn't make any of these memory-saving techniques desirable for EVP work. The sample rates for each of these represents points in time where the sample is made, but sound is continuous. There's no real instantaneous point in a sound or a sound wave. So when it replays a recording, it has to fill in the spaces between those samples, because if you look at it in a linear way, you'll have a solid box which represents a sound wave, and every 164 thousandths of an inch it removes a slice. Now, this is just these aren't actual numbers, it's just a way to try to picture this in your mind. So you have black, white, black, white, black, white, black, white, thousands of times per second. And what the codec does is when it plays it back, it has to analyze this audio file in these two black sections, and it has to take an average of what the codec believes should be in between there, and it fills it in. Now this is never anything you're going to hear with your ears, but the fewer samples you take, the less of the original audio representation is recorded and saved. Now here is a picture. We're going to talk about the sample rates, and here's a visual representation of what that may look like. You have a low quality sample rate and a high quality sample rate. Now on the low sample rate, you see the blue wave represents the sound wave on both of these diagrams. The red boxes indicate the sample that's taken per second. Now on the low sample rate, you can see that it's taking only 2 samples. Say this is a 2-second, it's not accurate, but suppose it's just a 2-second clip. And you can see all the blue areas that don't fall within those sample rates, that the algorithm has to make assumptions about what is supposed to be there. If you look at the high sample rate, you can see there are many more samples taken, and it's less averaging that the codec has to make, so it preserves more of the original audio file, or excuse me, the audio representation. So one way to minimize the problems and the errors in recordings is to increase the sample rate. To take more samples, the codec, like I said, has less averaging to do. It has more of the original audio data to work with. The easy way to remember this is the higher the sample rate, the more accurate the recorder will be at processing that audio. And voice recorders generally use the lowest sample rates to record voice quality instead of the full range of the audio in our environment. The second factor is compression. Many voice recorders use different compression techniques. Some are better than others. Unfortunately, they also result in a greater amount of alteration to the original audio signal, since more of the data is determined to be unnecessary and discarded. Later, the recorder will simulate what the various algorithms assume what should be there and insert its own data to fill in. The problem is no recorder can really know what's removed. Only simulations and guesses can be run to restore what sounds reasonably close to the original signal on either side of the removed segments. Now, this may be okay for regular speech, but when it comes to EVPs, we really don't know what frequency ranges make up an EVP, other than, if you put it on a spectrograph, you can see those ranges, but we don't know how they're created or what even creates them, and yet we're using recorders that are removing and altering the data based on what it is, what it assumes to be human speech. We can't know what part of an EVP is unnecessary or what part can be removed. So for EVP work, we really need to think about this a little bit. If we're going to use digital recorders, we need to use samples at the highest rate that you possibly can to prevent a vast majority of the conversion errors from the codec. And we need to eliminate the compression, which can change the audio that we had just recorded. Now we have 2 options to do this. First, we can go with an analog tape because it records actual signal instead of the digital equivalent. It has no conversions or compression errors. Or we can go with digital recorders and we can use better quality digital recording instead of one that's made for the human voice only. Cost-wise, analog tape recorders you can get, starting at $100. You can get them cheaper if they're used. But they can go up into many hundreds of dollars, even thousands of dollars if you get a very high-end reel-to-reel recorder, for example. If you choose a digital recorder, they can start. You can get them fairly cheap, $40 or so, and they can go up into the high hundreds and even thousands, depending on what you want. But if you're serious about EVPs, you'll need to get a recorder which is dependable and not prone to false positives and altered audio errors that you'll find on cheaper recorders. So, getting back to the analog tapes. The analog tapes, the way they work is whenever an electromagnet is fed an audio signal, it generates positive and negative fluxes based on the peaks and the troughs of the audio waveform. And the loudness determines the strength of that flux. The analog tape then stores the messages for a tape to play or decode later and play back. Now the tape has magnetic materials like iron oxide, chromium dioxide, or barium ferrite mixed with chemicals and binders that covers the surface of this tape. When you bring the electromagnetic close to the surface, the flux it's generating moves the magnetic particles in particular formations. So when you play them back, those formations make different sounds, when you're playing it back. They're read by the tape player head and transformed back into an audio signal. Now the neat thing about this is that the chemicals that they use on the tapes to ensure that only a magnet can move those little particles. So you can touch them and it's not going to move those magnetic particles, which is pretty interesting. So the one unique thing about an audio recorder is the way it sounds. Now there are different recording and reading processes that are involved, so it creates a whole slew of different characteristics causing that sound. The characteristics include saturation, static noise, or hissing, stereo cross-feeding, frequency loss, and a bunch of other things. Since there's only so much room for magnetic particles on that tape to move around, there comes a point when you record over it so many times, these magnetic particles can only move so far. And when you get to that point where they can't move anymore, it's called analog clipping. And that can create side effects even before it reaches that point. So we call that phenomenon saturation. And depending on the tape and electromagnetic employed, the sound of that saturation can differ. Some saturate the higher frequencies first, where others saturate the lower frequencies first, which gives it a warmer sound. Now the tape's motion and the fluctuation in speed due to the motors, different speeds that they're turning while it's recording, different speeds when it's playing back, they call that the wow effect or fluttering effect. And when the tape's magnetic head particles aren't aligned perfectly during the recording, which is often the case, we get crackles and pops, and that's that trademark audio tape sound. And back again, we'll talk a little bit about the wow and the wow effect, and that's the oscillation or change in pitch that's caused by the particle alignments being warped. Now there's a bunch of slight faults during the recording process that causes this effect. And flutter, again, they can be stretched or strained by the pitch rollers and the playheads and all this other stuff going on mechanically in there, that it causes fluctuations in the signal level, which we refer to as flutter. And tape noise, or hiss, refers to the noise floor of the audio caused by the low bit quantization, and the input preamp, transformers, and other components also add to this noise. And hysteresis is a sudden change in the magnetic particles of the audio tape. It's a result of the result is pops and cracks during the playback. So is analog recording better than digital? Well, it depends on who you ask and what people are actually looking for. The most significant advantages of analog recording is the unique sound quality. Analog formats add destructive noise and saturation to the audio in every processing step, whereas digital is extremely clean. This limitation gives a recording a character that we've all familiar with and heard, and some believe that this random noise, the background hissing and all that, adds to the chances of recording an EVP. I haven't seen anything that shows that as fact, but it's one of the things that a lot of investigators look for. They actually use software to create white noise and other such things. Now, the most significant advantage of digital audio is that it's cost effective, it's reliable, and the processing of digital audio is much cleaner. And you can also recall the files without having to note down the perimeter values or anything like that. So again, the advantages are cost. Digital audio is far more cost effective because it doesn't require, number one, physical storage other than the memory card, and most recorders have them built in, so you don't even have to have that. It's non-destructive editing. You can record on the same media over and over and over, and it doesn't degrade over time. Transferability. You can take digital audio and it can be transferred from one device to another without any quality degradation. It can be copied thousands of times, and as long as you're not changing the compression codecs, it's going to remain the exact same quality. And storage itself. Digital storage, like a hard disk or a solid state drive can have, terabytes, hundreds of thousands of hours of audio on something the size of a credit card. It's amazing how compact this format is in digital recording. Now, when it comes to reliability, digital storage, like cards, aren't susceptible to physical damage other than if you take it and snap it or you break one of the pins off or anything like that. It's not going to degrade the more you use it. You can store more of these files in the same tiny little spot that you can a cassette recorder or a reel-to-reel. You can use cloud storage to back your files up. You don't even have to have a physical drive on your computer or anywhere. You can upload it to a cloud and it'll be there virtually forever. And there's zero chance of data loss unless the server crashes and all that data is lost. And there again, getting back to the analog tape, although it has its unique qualities, they do wear down and they can get tattered, due to usage, and there's degradation, involved with that, and copying data from one tape player to another, you lose quality and that type of thing. So let's get specifically into how these recorders specifically work in detail. We're going to start with the digital voice recorders. Now, recording sound with digital voice recorders is pretty straightforward and basic. The sound source puts out waves, which is me speaking. It's picked up by the microphone, and the sound or audio signal, if it's a tone or anything like that, is converted by a unit called an ADC, or an analog to digital voice converter. And those are built into the voice recorders or cameras or whatever else you're recording the audio in. And this digital information is then stored on a chip inside that device. A memory card, that type of thing. Now, digital information, as you probably know, is broken down into zeros and ones, like I stated earlier. So things that start out as music or speech, it's broken down by that ADC in a series of zeros and ones that can be recorded, stored, retrieved by the voice recorder, and played back. Now, how the storage works is that storage levels are indistinguishable from each other. They're all made of digital codes consisting of a sequence of zeros and ones, like we said several times now. They take up very little space when in a digital form. However, once they're converted from this digital state, there's a wide range of formats they can be converted to. This is storage format of audio files. The formats play a big role in the overall sound quality, the bit rate per second, and other features that can impact the size as well as the overall quality, which we'll get into here in a little bit. Here's a few of the more common file formats for digital audio recording. You have M4A audio. Now, this is a compressed format that has the best audio quality, and it's smaller than MP3. So it's a smaller file but yet higher quality. However, most voice recorders don't give you that option to record in that format. You have MP3, which everyone's completely familiar with. It's popular because it's a relatively small file size and it's higher than the average quality for recording, unless you're doing some, extremely detailed work like EVPs. Now, it's not as good as M4A, but it holds its own against all the other compressed formats out there. You have FLAC, which stands for Free Loss Audio Codec. Now, this is a compressed audio file that has a bit rate per second, which varies depending on the device you use. A lot of professional recording studios consider the quality of this format to be really good. You have WMA, which is Windows Media Audio format. and these are based for Windows-based machines. It makes it a good sound quality, good audio quality, although the file size can be unmanageable depending on your system's storage capabilities or your voice recorders. And there again, these other formats, with the exception of MP3, aren't really supported by a lot of digital voice recorders out there. Now, if you're recording a microphone to your computer, there are a lot of codecs out there and compression formats that you can save those files to. But when you take it off your voice recorder and convert it to one of those, there's going to be some data loss. Unless, of course, you're recording to a WAV or a raw audio file, which I'm getting ready to get into right now. Now, this a WAV file is a raw audio format. It's just raw audio. It's been around for a long time, and it produces extremely high audio quality playback. Now, its main downside, like I said, is its size. You'll need a lot of storage to store that large file. And if your voice recorder has limited storage capacity, it might not be a good idea to select this format, because you may be better off in that situation using the best compressed audio format that's available on your particular recorder. Now, what are the advantages of using a digital voice recorder instead of using your smartphone? First of all, it's convenient to use your cell phone because you already have it on you. All you got to do is pick it up, open your app, click record, and it's going to save it just like you would save it on a voice recorder. But a voice recorder is going to have a longer battery life. It's going to be a much better sound quality. The controls are going to be a lot easier to access on your voice recorder. And your voice recorder is going to have a much longer format support. You're going to be able to record on a lot more formats than you would a cell phone, which may have one or two different formats. So how do you pick out the right voice recorder for your needs? Pay close attention to a couple of the following factors. First is your recording time, or your storage size, basically, is what it comes down to. How long the batteries will last, the quality of the recordings, the quality of the microphone on the recordings, and of course, like I mentioned, the recording formats that are available for you to use. It's important to use high quality microphones. Even if the microphone that's in your voice recorder does a good job and has a good sound quality, compared to external microphones, there's no comparison. These voice recorders, these small digital voice recorders that you pay $30 or $40 or even $50 for, the microphones aren't of the highest quality. So any lapel microphone or any type of external microphone that you plug into a voice recorder is going to be superior in not only sound quality, but frequency response ranges as well. So there again, you want to look for something that has a high quality microphone, like Sony and Olympus. They have some really good internal microphones. You want one where you can select the volume of level recording, basically low recording level, medium recording level, high recording level. This gives you some options on the input for that microphone. And those are the big things that I would look for in a voice recorder. Particularly, I do use external microphones. I use binaural microphones. The reason I use binaural microphones is because I like to record in 3 dimensions. I want to know, not only do I hear something, I want to know what direction that sound came from. So that's just my particular preference. So let's get into these digital formats a little deeper, and we'll talk about audio bitrate. Now, bitrate is a term used to explain the amount of data that's being transferred into the audio. So as a general rule, the higher bitrate means better audio quality. Audio bitrate is the amount of data that's stored in the file that you're listening to or saving. In simpler terms, it's an expression used of the amount of data that the file produces every second. So when you listen to digital music, you come across the files that have that little, say, 32 kbps behind it, or 128, 64. That's the bit rate. So if you're recording 60 kilobits per second bit rate, that means every second of audio you record, that file size is going to be 64 kilobits. And every audio recording has a bit rate associated with it. In each recording, in every second of the recording, the audio file contains a certain amount of bits of data. When we talk about sound files, this is calculated by the number of kilobits of data per second. So, for example, if you see something like 280 kilobits, like I said a few minutes ago, it's 280 kilobits stored per second of audio. And that is the amount of data that's produced. So, let's look at common files and what you're likely to encounter and explore the details of each one of these little things. Like WAV, which is an uncompressed raw audio file format. It was developed by IBM and Microsoft. And, excuse me, it's produced by IBM, and Apple made its own version called AIFF, which you probably heard of before, and it uses the same technology. And like I said earlier, they're both uncompressed, high-quality audio files. Now, a high-quality WAV file has an audio bit rate of 1,411 kilobits at 16 bits per second. So what this is saying is every second of recording time, it's 1.4 megabits. So it doesn't take long for this raw audio file to fill up digital storage. It's a very large file, and it's difficult to work with on a slower PC. And Mp3 audio bitrate. And there's a comparison to this. The comparison for the MP3 only records at 326 kilobits at 16 bits per second. So 300 kilobits per second is a lot different than 1.4 megabytes per second as far as storage is concerned. But at the same time, you have to remember that that codec is removing frequencies above and below what we can hear, making that file size smaller. And the sample rate is much, much lower on these compressed files, they're again helping to make the file smaller. So the difference between bit rate and sample rate is that sample rate is the number of audio samples that are taken every second, where bit rate is the number of bits recorded per unit of time or per second. So the bit depth measures the accuracy at which the samples were encoded. So those are the two main differences between the two. So a higher bit rate is better audio quality. The right bit rate for a file depends on what you want to use that file for and the way you're going to deliver it. A high bit rate means high quality audio if the sample rate and depth are also high. So the more information that you save through higher bit rate and sample rates, the better your quality of audio is going to be. So we're going to get into a little more detail, the compressed versus uncompressed. I basically went over a lot of that, but this will go into it just a little bit in a different way or a little more detailed. Again, back to the uncompressed file formats. The WAV file or AIFF are pretty much perfect representations of the audio that was documented. Now, if you convert something from a compressed format, an uncompressed format to another, it's a perfect copy. So if I take a WAV file and I save it as an AIFF, it's a clone of each other with a different package. It's exactly the same bit for bit, 0 per 0, 1 per 1. It is an identical clone. Now, if you take a CD and you copy it in a WAV format on a computer, then burn it, onto a CD using the WAV you created, those two CDs will be virtually identical. Again, it doesn't matter the medium that you're copying to. It is the file format, the bit rate, and sample rate. So it's a perfect clone. And like I said, the only problem with these uncompressed file formats is that they're huge. If all the audio on your 4 gig iPod Nano, for example, were in an uncompressed format, you'd be able to do about, maybe 4 albums, maybe, if you rip them from CD. Now, compressed formats are the ones that use little tricks and cut corners to keep the file size small, like we mentioned earlier. But there's a ton of others besides just MP3 and WMA. I mean, there's a lot of them. AAC, that iTunes uses. For example, say you have a program that's your voice recorder is recording in MP3 format. It'll get rid of some of the high and low frequencies that it thinks is out of the human hearing range, so it's deemed unnecessary. It performs a lot more complicated calculations than that. I mean, that's oversimplifying what's happening here. But it's one of the simplest examples. The obvious benefit is that it doesn't take up near as much space as an uncompressed file. But here's what happens when you copy compressed formats. Now, for the average person, there's not much difference between the sound quality between high quality compression and uncompressed formats. To the human ear, it's almost identical unless there's some type of background static or anything. Now, every time an audio file is converted into a compressed format, it's not a perfect copy, and it loses some of that information during transfer. Now, it's kind of, if you picture like going to a Xerox machine and copying a copy of a copy of a copy, you'll see how it deteriorates as you make copies. And visually, audio files are the same way. They don't take up, as like I said, as much space, but you're losing quality every time you convert that to a different compressed format. So it doesn't even matter if the audio is compressed in an extremely high bit rate, you're still going to lose information as you copy from one compressed format to another. So if you have an FLAC, for example, in your podcast, and here's a perfect example of what I'm talking about. If you have an FLAC compressed format on your podcast that you're creating or whatever it is you're doing, in order to get it to a Windows Media, you have to convert that file to an MP2 or other, albeit lightly compressed format. The station or the place that is going to be streaming your audio gets your downloads. It broadcasts it on their internet stream, and since the software for the stream is based on, say, MP3, again, they changed one compressed format to another compressed format, and then you lose more information. And this file is compressed again. So by the time the actual listeners that are listening to it while it's streaming, the audio is compressed at least 3 times. And at this stage, the drop in quality is extreme. Even to someone with an untrained ear, you're going to hear the difference. So to sum all this up, whenever possible, use an uncompressed audio format with the highest bit rate and the highest sample rate that you can possibly do on that recorder. And if that means buying an external micro SD card to increase your capabilities of your voice recorder, that's what I recommend doing. It gives you more of the original audio data to work with. There's less compression errors involved because there's more samples that were being taken. And it's going to preserve the entire frequency response range of your microphones, not just what the human ear can hear. And in my particular opinion, I think sometimes there may be some audio information that we can hear during playback that we can't hear with our own ears. And if you're eliminating that while you're recording, you never even know existed in the first place. So I appreciate any comments, any questions, you can post them below. For those of you that are listening to this podcast, if you were interested in seeing the videos so you can take a look at the picture of the different sample rates, I encourage you to go to Dover Paratech on YouTube, check the video out. So until next time, thanks for your time. Have a good day, and we'll talk with y'all later.